The storm over Kandahar had teeth. Lightning split the darkness like artillery fire, turning the mountains into momentary ghosts before plunging them back into absolute black. Inside the Tactical Operations Center, 12 operators watched a single green blip crawl across the radar screen, an A-10 Thunderbolt II, call sign Widow 1, flying at 400 feet in conditions that had grounded every other bird in theater. The SEAL Team Commander, Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb, stood with his arms crossed, jaw tight. His men were pinned down in a valley 70 clicks north, taking fire from 3 sides, and their air support had just told them to sit tight until the weather cleared. That's when she'd keyed her radio with a voice like gravel and honey. "Bagram Tower, Widow 1, I'm taking the package." The controller had stammered something about visibility and safety protocols. She'd cut him off mid-sentence. "Those men don't have time for safety protocols." Now Webb stared at that blip, wondering who the hell flew like this. The meteorologist had called it a once-in-a-decade system, winds gusting to 70 knots, visibility measured in feet, not miles, the kind of weather that made helicopters flip and fast movers lose horizon. But A-10s weren't fast movers. They were tanks with wings, flown by pilots who thought getting shot at was just part of the commute. Still, this was different. This was suicide with extra steps. The base intelligence officer, a captain named Rivera, pulled up the personnel file without being asked. "Captain Cale Morvan," he read aloud, pronouncing it like Cale. 34, prior enlisted maintainer, flew combat search and rescue helicopters before transitioning to fixed-wing. 217 combat missions, 3 distinguished flying crosses. Someone whistled low. Webb didn't move. "Family status," Rivera scrolled. "Single mother, 1 daughter 7 years old. Husband was Marine Corps, killed in action 4 years ago during an embassy evacuation in Africa." The room went quiet except for the rain hammering the roof. Webb uncrossed his arms. A pilot with everything to lose, flying into a storm that had everything to take, for men she'd never met. He tried to picture her, probably some grizzled veteran with ice in her veins and nothing left to prove. The radar blip descended another 50 feet. The controller's voice crackled through the overhead speaker. "Widow 1, recommend you turn back. We're showing lightning strikes directly in your flight path." Her response came through static and thunder. "Copy lightning. Still got 8 brothers waiting on me." Widow 1 continuing. Webb felt something shift in his chest. His men called themselves the quiet professionals, the ones who did the impossible before breakfast. But right now, in a storm that made gods nervous, there was only one person doing the impossible, and she was doing it alone. The A-10 Thunderbolt II is not a graceful aircraft. It looks like something designed by someone who hates beauty and loves efficiency. A flying bathtub built around a gun so large it has to fire in bursts, or the recoil would stall the engines. The GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon fires 30mm rounds the size of milk bottles at a rate that turns anything on the receiving end into memory and smoke. The Air Force calls it close air support. Infantry calls it salvation. Cale Morvan called it her office. She'd spent 6 years as an enlisted crew chief before her commander noticed she could land a damaged helicopter on a postage stamp and told her to apply for flight school. She'd done it mainly because the extra pay meant she could move her daughter out of base housing and into something with a yard. After her husband died, flying became the only place where the noise in her head went quiet. Now, at 400 feet in zero visibility, she flew entirely on instruments and instinct. The storm buffeted the Warthog like an angry child shaking a toy, but the jet's heavy frame absorbed the violence with stubborn indifference. Rain sheeted across the canopy so thick she couldn't see her own wingtips. Lightning strobed the cockpit in freeze frames, her gloved hands on the stick, the green glow of instruments, the photo of a little girl taped to the dashboard smiling gap-toothed at a camera. Her daughter's name was Iris. She had her father's eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. Every mission, Cale made the same promise, come home, but tonight the promise felt heavier. Her GPS showed the valley approaching. She dropped to 300 feet, letting the terrain-following radar guide her through the mountain pass. The radio crackled. "Widow 1, Dagger 6, We are danger close, taking effective fire from multiple positions. Need immediate support. The voice belonged to someone young, scared, trying not to sound like either. Kale keyed her mic. Dagger 6, Widow 1. Pop smoke and get small. I'm 30 seconds out. She armed her weapons systems, 2 Maverick missiles, 700 rounds of 30 mic, and a full load of unguided rockets. The Warthog shuddered as another gust tried to flip her inverted. She corrected with the stick, smooth and automatic, her body remembering what her mind didn't have time to think about. Below, through breaks in the clouds, she caught glimpses of the valley, muzzle flashes like angry fireflies, tracers arcing red through the darkness. The SEALs had been compromised during an intelligence raid. What was supposed to be a soft target turned out to be a regional Taliban command post. Now 12 Americans were surrounded by 50 fighters who knew the terrain and had nothing to lose. Her targeting pod was useless in this weather, the infrared camera showing nothing but white noise and rain. She'd have to do this the old way, eyes in geometry, reading the battlefield like a photograph burning into her memory during each lightning flash. She descended to 200 feet. The mountains rose on either side like the walls of a cathedral. Wind shear tried to slam her into the rocks. She fired chaff and flares, not because there were missiles, but because the burning magnesium gave her a momentary reference point in the darkness, something to gauge her altitude against. Dagger 6, I have visual on your smoke. Confirm all friendlies are north of the red smoke. Affirm all personnel north. Everything south is hostile. Kale's finger moved to the trigger. The first run she came in from the east, following the valley floor at 180 knots with the landing lights off and her mind perfectly calm. This was the place where fear couldn't follow, where there was only the mission and the mathematics of violence. She acquired the target cluster, a stone compound lit by diesel generators, men running between buildings with rifles. Her thumb depressed the trigger. The GAU-8 opened up with a sound like the world tearing in half. 70 rounds per second, each one a fist of depleted uranium traveling at 3,000 feet per second. The gun camera later showed the compound disintegrating, walls exploding into dust, vehicles shredding into component atoms. She walked the fire across the target area for 3 seconds, the recoil slowing the Warthog by 20 knots, and then she was past, climbing back into the storm. Dagger 6, Widow 1, guns on target, assess. There was a pause filled with static. When the voice came back, it was different, steadier, grateful. Widow 1, good effects on target. We're moving to secondary position. Stand by for new coordinates. She banked hard, the G-forces pressing her into the seat. Rain hammered the canopy. Lightning revealed the valley in snapshot clarity, smoke rising from the compound, small figures running, the SEALs displaced and moving fast. She checked her fuel. 18 minutes of station time before she'd have to run for the tanker. Enough for 3, maybe 4 more runs. Her hands were steady on the stick. Below, men were living because she'd shown up. That was the job. That was the only thing that mattered. The second pass, she used the Mavericks. The missiles were designed for tanks, guided by infrared to home in on heat signatures. In this weather they were almost useless, but she caught a break. A technical truck with its engine running, thermal bloom like a beacon. She pickled one missile, felt the Warthog lurch as 300 pounds of fire and forget left the rails. 5 seconds later, the valley lit up orange. The explosion was large enough to see from space, the technical truck and everyone near it converted to physics and memory. Widow 1, excellent effect, but they're bringing up reinforcements from the south. We need you to hold them at the pass. Kale checked her tactical display. The pass was a narrow defile where the valley met the foothills, a natural choke point. If the Taliban got armor through, the SEALs would be overrun in minutes. She came around for the third run and saw them. 3 vehicles moving fast, headlights off, using the storm for cover. This time she used the rockets, walking a line of high-explosive death across the road. The first vehicle swerved and flipped, the second exploded, the third stopped and disgorged fighters who scattered into the rocks. She circled back and hosed them with the gun, cold and methodical, turning the pass into a graveyard. In the TOC at Bagram, Lieutenant Commander Webb watched the gun camera feed with something like reverence. Every burst was precise. Every maneuver was calculated. This wasn't luck or adrenaline. This was a master at work. Rivera looked up from his monitor. "Sir, she's been flying for 40 minutes in conditions that should have killed her 10 minutes in." Webb didn't look away from the screen. "How much fuel does she have left?" 7 minutes, maybe 8. On the radio, Cale's voice came through calm as Sunday morning. "Dagger 6, Widow 1, I'm Winchester on missiles, low on gas. I can give you one more gun run before I have to leave you." Widow 1 understood. "You've done more than enough. We're moving to extract point now. Thank you doesn't cover it." She didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice was softer. "Get home safe, boys. Someone's waiting for every one of you." She made the final run at 100 feet, pouring everything left in the magazine into a mortar position that had the seals pinned. The gun went dry with a mechanical click, and she pulled hard, climbing back into the storm with her fuel gauge reading fumes and prayers. The tanker was 60 clicks south, orbiting at 20,000 feet above the weather. She had to climb blind through the storm, trust her instruments, and hope the winds didn't push her into a mountain. At 12,000 feet, her right engine coughed. The Warthog could fly on one engine, but not in this. She adjusted the mixture, enriching the fuel flow, and the engine caught again, sputtering like an old man with pneumonia. "Bagram Tower, Widow 1, I'm fuel critical, climbing to tanker altitude. Request priority clearance." Widow 1, cleared direct. "Your tanker is standing by." At 19,000 feet, she broke through the top of the storm into clear air and stars. The tanker was a KC-135, an old warhorse that had been refueling aircraft since before Cale was born. She slid into position behind it, exhausted and shaking now that the adrenaline was fatting. The boom operator guided her in with the kind of gentle patience usually reserved for teaching someone to drive. "Easy, Widow 1. You're doing great, just a little more forward. Contact." The fuel flowed into her tanks, life returning to the Warthog in gallons per minute. She closed her eyes for just a second, let herself feel the weight of what she'd just done. 12 men were alive because she'd refused to let a storm stop her. When she opened her eyes, her hands were still steady on the stick. 20 minutes later, she landed at Bagram. The rain had followed her south, turning the tarmac into a black mirror reflecting runway lights. She taxied to her parking spot and shut down the engines. The silence was profound. She sat in the cockpit for a long moment, looking at the photo of her daughter. Then she unstrapped and climbed down the ladder, legs unsteady, soaked through with rain and sweat. Lieutenant Commander Webb was waiting on the ramp with his entire team. 12 men in full kit, faces streaked with dirt and blood, standing at attention in the rain. When she approached, Webb saluted. She stopped, confused. Officers didn't salute each other in the field, and anyway, this felt wrong, like she'd walked into someone else's ceremony. Webb held the salute. "Captain Morvan, my men and I are alive because you flew through hell to reach us. We won't forget it." Cale returned the salute, uncomfortable with the attention. "Just doing my job, sir." One of the SEALs, a kid who couldn't have been more than 23, stepped forward. He was crying and not trying to hide it. "Ma'am, my wife just had a baby girl 3 weeks ago. I haven't even met her yet. Because of you, I will. Thank you." She didn't know what to say to that. What do you say to someone whose entire life just pivoted on your decision to ignore the weather and fly anyway? She settled for a nod. The kid stepped back into formation. Webb lowered his salute. "Your call sign, Widow 1, can I ask why?" She glanced away toward the mountains hidden by rain and darkness. "My husband was a Marine. After he died, I kept flying. Someone told me I was like a black widow, small, underestimated, and lethal when cornered." Webb smiled, a real smile with warmth in it. "That's the best call sign I've ever heard." They stood in the rain for another moment, 12 silent operators and one pilot who looked like she belonged in a coffee shop instead of a cockpit. Then Rivera arrived with an umbrella and news. "Captain, you're wanted in the operations center. The general wants to talk to you." Cale groaned. "Am I in trouble?" Rivera grinned. "Only if being a hero is against regulations." She walked toward the TOC with slow steps, feeling every minute of the flight catching up to her. Behind her, she heard one of the SEALs say quietly, "I'd follow her anywhere." The story of that night spread through the base like wildfire through dry grass. By morning, everyone knew about the pilot who'd flown through the storm of the decade to save a SEAL team. The intelligence weenies called it unprecedented. The meteorologists called it impossible. The infantry called it Tuesday for an A-10 driver. Cale tried to avoid the attention, but there's no hiding in a combat zone when you're suddenly famous. Pilots she'd never spoken to bought her coffee. Maintainers who'd serviced her jet stopped her to shake her hand. Even the Air Force Public Affairs Office showed up with cameras and questions, but she told them to get lost in terms that made the PAO major blush. What she couldn't avoid was the conversation with Brigadier General Sarah Okonkwo, the wing commander. Okonkwo was a fighter pilot from the old school, back when women had to be twice as good to get half the respect. She'd flown F-16s in Desert Storm and carried scars from an ejection that should have killed her. She understood the calculus of risk versus reward better than anyone. Cale stood at attention in the general's office, still in her flight suit, hair pulled back in a bun that had survived the storm better than her nerves. Okonkwo sat behind her desk, reading the after-action report with an expression Cale couldn't parse. Finally, the general looked up. "Captain Morvan, do you understand how lucky you are to be alive?" "Yes, ma'am." "Do you understand how reckless your decision was?" Cale hesitated. "Yes, ma'am." Okonkwo stood and walked to the window overlooking the flight line. Outside, A-10 sat in neat rows, ugly and beautiful at the same time. "I'm required to tell you that what you did violated about 15 different safety protocols and probably gave the Risk Management Office a collective aneurysm. I'm also required to consider disciplinary action for unauthorized flight in weather below minimums." Cale felt her stomach drop. "Ma'am, those men," Okonkwo held up a hand. "Let me finish. I'm required to consider it, but I'm also authorized to recognize that sometimes the right decision looks reckless on paper. 12 Americans are breathing because you ignored the rules. That matters more than any protocol." She turned to face Cale directly. "I'm recommending you for the Air Force Cross. It won't bring your husband back or make single motherhood easier, but maybe someday your daughter will understand what her mother did and why it mattered." Cale's eyes burned. She blinked hard. "You, ma'am? Don't thank me yet. You're grounded for 72 hours while we inspect your jet. Something about flying through a thunderstorm at 400 feet puts stress on the airframe." Okonkwo's expression softened. "Go call your daughter. Tell her you're okay. That's an order." Cale saluted and left before the tears could fall. She found a quiet corner of the communications building and dialed the number that connected her to everything that mattered. Her daughter answered on the third ring. "Mommy." "Hey baby, it's me. Are you coming home soon?" Cale closed her eyes. "Soon, sweetheart, really soon." 3 days later, the maintenance chief signed off on her jet. The A-10 had taken a beating. Lightning strikes had scorched the tail, hail had dimpled the wings, and the gun barrel needed replacing after she'd fired it until the rifling wore smooth. But the old bird was flight-ready, because A-10s were built to absorb punishment and keep fighting, like their pilots. Cale flew her first post-storm mission on a clear morning with unlimited visibility. The contrast was jarring. Where before she'd navigated by instruments and faith, now she could see for 100 miles. The mountains were beautiful in the sunrise, snow-capped peaks glowing pink and gold. She almost missed the storm. Almost. Her mission was routine, armed overwatch for a supply convoy moving through contested territory. She orbited at 15,000 feet, watching the trucks crawl along the highway like beetles on a ribbon. The radio chatter was calm, professional, boring in the best possible way. Then a new voice cut through the frequency. Any station, this is Dagger 6. Be advised, Widow 1 is airborne. If you need saving, now's your chance." Cale smiled despite herself. Webb had promised to buy her a beer when he got stateside, and apparently he'd also decided to become her unofficial public relations manager. Other voices chimed in, pilots and ground controllers who'd heard the story. "Good to have you up there, Widow 1. Widow 1, Warthog 3. Save some bad guys for the rest of us." She keyed her mic. "Warthog 3, you know I can't make promises." The laughter that came back felt like acceptance, like belonging. She'd been flying combat missions for years, but this was different. This was respect earned in the hardest currency there was. The weeks blurred together the way they always did downrange. Kale flew, slept, flew again, the rhythm of deployment grinding away the calendar. She counted days until redeployment the way prisoners count scratches on cell walls, obsessively, hopelessly, with a kind of desperate arithmetic. But something had changed after the storm. Other pilots sought her opinion on tactics. Commanders requested her specifically for high-risk missions. New wingmen looked at her like she'd invented fire. She hated the attention and craved it in equal measure, the contradiction making her feel like a hypocrite. One afternoon she was sitting in the ready room, studying target photos for a night mission, when Captain Jerome Carter dropped into the chair beside her. Carter flew F-16s and had the ego that came with it. Fighter pilots considered themselves the aristocracy of the air, while A-10 drivers were viewed as blue-collar workers with wings. He'd never spoken to her before. "Heard you're teaching a class on weather penetration next week," he said. She didn't look up. "Not teaching, briefing, there's a difference. Still, must be nice being famous." Now she looked at him. Carter had the kind of face that had gotten through life on charm, handsome enough to coast, not scarred enough to have learned humility. "Is there a point coming, or are you just filling space with words?" He laughed. "I like you, you're mean." "I'm busy." "Fair enough. But here's the thing. I'm leading a strike package into a high-threat area tomorrow. Fast movers, lots of SAMs, the whole dance. I requested you for CSAR backup." She raised an eyebrow. Combat search and rescue was dangerous, unglamorous work. If someone got shot down, the CSAR bird flew into the same threat environment to pull them out. It required flying low and slow while people shot at you, which was the A-10's entire design philosophy. "Why me?" Cale asked. Carter's expression shifted, something genuine breaking through the bravado. "Because if I punch out behind enemy lines, I want the pilot who flew through a storm to save SEALs. I want someone who doesn't quit." She studied him for a long moment. "Okay, but if you get shot down because you were doing something stupid, I'm going to tell your mother." He grinned. "Deal." The next day Cale flew the CSAR mission, orbiting 20 miles from the target while Carter and his flight of F-16s turned an enemy radar installation into modern art. The strike went perfectly, missiles in, explosions out, everyone home by lunch. But Carter made a point of finding her afterward in the debrief room. "Thanks for being there, Widow One. Knowing you had my back made it easier," she shrugged. "That's the job. Maybe, but not everyone does it like you." He left and she sat alone with the compliment, unsure what to do with it. Praise always felt like a trick, like someone was setting her up for disappointment. But maybe that was just the fear talking. That night she called home and her daughter talked for 20 minutes straight about a field trip to an aquarium. Cale closed her eyes and listened, letting the sound of Iris's voice wash away the noise of war, the weight of expectation, the fear that someday she wouldn't come home. The medal ceremony happened on a bright October morning with the mountains as witnesses. The entire wing stood in formation, while General Okonkwo pinned the Air Force Cross to Cale's chest, a bronze cross with an eagle in the center, suspended from a blue ribbon. It was the second highest military decoration, one step below the Medal of Honor, and Cale felt like an imposter wearing it. The citation read like fiction: "For extraordinary heroism in military operations against an armed enemy." Disregarding her own safety, single-handedly saved the lives of 12 American service members. She stood at attention while they read words that made her sound like someone else, someone braver and less scared. When it was over and the formation dismissed, Lieutenant Commander Webb approached with his team. They'd flown in from Virginia just for this, 12 men in dress uniforms looking uncomfortable and proud. Webb shook her hand. "Congratulations, Captain. You earned this 1,000 times over." "I just flew the jet, sir. You did the hard part." One of the SEALs, the kid with the newborn daughter, stepped forward holding a small wooden box. "Ma'am, we wanted to give you something. It's not official and it probably violates some regulation, but we don't care." He opened the box. Inside was a trident pin, the gold symbol of the Navy SEALs, eagle clutching an anchor and trident and flintlock pistol. It was their most sacred emblem, earned through the hardest training in the military. Cale stared at it. "I can't accept this. I'm not a SEAL." Webb smiled. The trident isn't about the uniform, Captain, it's about the person. You flew into hell to pull us out. Far as we're concerned, your family. The kid pinned the trident next to her Air Force cross, unofficial and unauthorized and perfect. Kale felt tears coming and didn't fight them. "Thank you," she whispered. They stood together for a photo, 12 operators and one pilot, all alive because of a storm and a decision and a promise kept. The photo would end up on a wall at SEAL Team 7's headquarters, right next to the Medal of Honor recipients and KIA Memorial. Years later, new guys would ask who the Air Force pilot was. The answer was always the same. "That's Widow One. She's the reason we buy A-10 pilots drinks for life." After the ceremony, Kale found a quiet spot behind the hangar and called her daughter. Iris answered immediately. "Mommy, did you get your medal?" "I did, baby." "Are you a hero now?" Kale watched a pair of A-10s taxi past, their turbofan engines howling. "Heroes are people who do their job when it's hard. By that measure, there are a lot of heroes here. I'm just one of them." "I think you're the best one," Iris said with the absolute certainty only a 7-year-old can muster. Kale smiled. "I think you're pretty great too." They talked until Iris had to go to school, and then Kale sat in the quiet, holding the phone, feeling the weight of the medals on her chest and the weight of love in her heart. Both were heavy. Both were worth carrying. She stood and walked back to her jet. There was a mission that afternoon and someone had to fly it. Might as well be her. The deployment ended the way they all do, with exhaustion, relief, and a C-17 cargo plane full of soldiers heading home. Kale sat in the webbed seating, surrounded by her squadron, watching the mountains shrink through the window. Afghanistan had taken so much from her. Her husband first, parts of her peace, sleep without nightmares. But it had also given her something, purpose, competence, a story that would outlive her. She thought about the SEALs somewhere in Virginia, back with their families, living futures that almost didn't exist. She thought about the storm and the choice and the knowledge that she'd probably do it again, because that's who she was. The plane climbed through weather, nothing like that night, just ordinary turbulence, and Kale closed her eyes. 12 hours later they landed in Delaware, and she walked down the ramp into cold American air. Her daughter was waiting at the bottom with Kale's mother, holding a sign that read "Welcome Home, Mommy" in crayon. Iris ran toward her and Kale dropped her bags to catch her, lifting the girl high, feeling her laugh against her chest. "You came back," Iris said. "I promised, didn't I?" Kale looked at her mother over Iris's head. Her mom was crying quietly, the way she always did at homecomings. 3 generations of military families, intimately familiar with the cost of service and the miracle of return. They drove home through suburbs that felt alien after months of desert and mountains. Kale kept looking at ordinary things, traffic lights, coffee shops, people complaining about parking, and feeling the surreal disconnect of someone who'd recently been shot at. It would pass. It always did. That night after Iris was asleep, Kale sat in her backyard with a beer and stared at stars she couldn't navigate by. Her phone buzzed, a text from Webb. "Heard you made it home safe. My team wants to know when you're visiting Virginia so we can buy you about 1,000 beers. Fair warning, we don't take no for an answer." She smiled and typed back, "I'll come when you guys learn to fly in bad weather." His response came immediately. "Ouch, and never. That's what we have you for." She set the phone down and breathed the night air, feeling the quiet settle into her bones. The war would continue without her. Other pilots would fly other missions. The cycle would turn as it always had, as it always would. But for now she was home. For now her daughter slept safely upstairs. For now the storms were someone else's problem. She finished her beer and went inside, checking on Iris one more time before bed. The girl slept with her arms thrown wide, dreaming whatever children dream. Kale stood in the doorway watching her, making a new promise. To be present, to be whole, to be more than just the sum of her deployments. It was the hardest promise she'd ever made. The next morning she reported to her stateside squadron at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona. The desert here was different, less hostile, more alien. But the A-10s were the same. She walked the flight line like a pilgrim returning to a shrine, running her hand along a fuselage, feeling the texture of metal and rivets. A voice called out behind her, "Captain Morvan." She turned. A young lieutenant stood there, fresh out of flight school, eyes wide with the kind of hero worship that made Cale uncomfortable. "Yes, ma'am, I'm Lieutenant Alex Reeves. I just got assigned to the squadron. I wanted to introduce myself because you're the reason I chose A-10s." Cale blinked. "Come again." Reeves looked embarrassed but pushed forward. "I heard about the Storm mission during my advanced training. My instructor said it was the most tactically sound piece of flying he'd ever seen. I requested warthogs because I wanted to learn from pilots like you." She didn't know what to say. The idea that her decision, her reckless, terrifying, possibly stupid decision, had inspired someone to choose this aircraft and this mission felt absurd and humbling in equal measure. "Lieutenant, I appreciate that, but you should know that night was an exception. Most missions are boring, uncomfortable, and bureaucratic. The heroic moments are rare." Reeves nodded seriously. "That's what makes them matter, ma'am." She couldn't argue with that. "Welcome to the squadron, Lieutenant. Try not to die doing something I would do." He grinned and saluted. She returned it and watched him walk away, too young and too eager, exactly like she'd been once upon a time. The cycle turning, the mission continuing, the next generation stepping up because someone before them showed it was possible. That afternoon in the squadron bar, a dusty room with call signs carved into the wooden tables, a pilot named Major Frank Kozlowski bought her a whiskey. Kozlowski was old school, a veteran of Desert Storm who'd been flying warthogs since before Cale was born. "Heard you got yourself famous, Widow One." Cale accepted the drink. "Not by choice." Kozlowski laughed, a sound like gravel in a blender. "Never is, kid, but you wear it well. That mission you flew, that's going in the textbooks. That's how they'll teach weather penetration and risk management for the next 20 years. She sipped the whiskey, letting it burn. "I broke about 15 rules, Frank. Best missions usually do." He raised his glass. "To breaking rules and saving lives." She clinked her glass against his. Around them, other pilots gathered, drawn by some invisible signal that interesting conversation was happening. They told stories, near misses, close calls, the gallows humor of people who'd seen death and decided to laugh at it. Cale listened more than she talked, absorbing the culture and camaraderie she'd missed downrange. Near midnight, Lieutenant Reeves approached hesitantly. "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" "Depends on the question." "When you were in that storm, were you scared?" The bar went quiet. Every pilot there had faced their own version of that question, the moment when training ended and survival began. Cale considered lying, giving the answer that made her sound fearless, but Reeves deserved better. "Terrified," she said. "Every second, but fear and action aren't opposites, Lieutenant. You can be scared and still fly the jet. That's not courage. That's just doing your job when it matters." Reeves nodded slowly, processing. "Thank you, ma'am." The conversation resumed, the moment passed, but Cale felt something shift. Maybe this was what came after the mission. Not glory or fame, but the responsibility of showing others that fear was normal, doubt was human, and both could be overcome. She finished her whiskey and stood to leave. The weeks became months. Cale flew training sorties, taught classes on tactical employment, and struggled with the transition from combat to peacetime. The adrenaline economy of deployment, where every mission mattered and every decision had weight, gave way to the grinding routine of garrison life. She found herself missing the war, which made her feel guilty. How could she miss a place that had killed her husband and tried to kill her? But she did. She missed the clarity of purpose, the simplicity of knowing exactly what needed to be done. Her daughter noticed. One evening after dinner, Iris climbed into her lap and asked, "Mommy, why are you sad?" Cale hugged her tight. "I'm not sad, baby. You look sad. You look how you looked after Daddy died." The observation hit like a missile. Cale took a breath. "Sometimes grown-ups have feelings that are complicated. I'm not sad exactly. I'm just trying to figure out how to be here instead of there." "Do you want to go back?" Cale looked at her daughter, 7 years old, impossibly perceptive, already learning that love meant worrying about the people you cared for. "No, sweetheart, I want to be here with you. That's the most important thing." Iris nodded against her chest. "Okay, but if you need to be sad sometimes, that's okay too." They sat together in the quiet, and Cale marveled at the wisdom hidden in children. Her daughter understood what therapists and commanders couldn't quite grasp, that soldiers carried pieces of war home with them, and those pieces didn't disappear just because the shooting stopped. The next day she made an appointment with the base psychologist. It felt like defeat and victory at the same time. 6 months after returning home, Cale received orders for a new assignment. Nellis Air Force Base, Nevada, home of the Air Force's weapons school where the best pilots learn to become instructors. It was the dream assignment, the pinnacle of a tactical aviation career. She accepted immediately, then spent a week terrified she'd made a mistake. The weapons school was legendary for its difficulty. Students averaged 4 hours of sleep per night, flew multiple sorties per day, and studied tactics until their eyes bled. The washout rate was 30%. And now she'd be teaching there. Her mother helped her pack folding clothes with the efficiency of someone who'd moved military families for decades. "You're going to be amazing," she said. Cale taped another box shut. "You have to say that, you're my mom." "I have to say it because it's true. You flew through a storm that grounded everyone else. You think teaching pilots is going to be harder than that. Different kind of hard. This is about knowledge, not guts." Her mother stopped folding and looked at her directly. "Cale, you've spent your whole life proving you belong, first as an enlisted maintainer, then as a pilot, then as a woman in combat. You've earned this 10 times over. When are you going to start believing it?" The question hung in the air. When indeed? They finished packing in silence. 3 weeks later, Cale stood in front of her first class at Nellis, 12 pilots, all majors or lieutenant colonels, all with thousands of flight hours and combat experience. They looked at her with expressions ranging from skepticism to curiosity. She was younger than most of them, lower ranking than several, and they all knew her story. The storm, the SEALs, the medals. She started with the truth. "Gentlemen, I know what you're thinking. The famous widow one is going to teach us to be heroes. Well, I'm not here to teach heroics. I'm here to teach tactics because good tactics mean you won't need to be heroic." One of the lieutenant colonels raised his hand. "Ma'am, with respect, that storm mission wasn't just good tactics. That was guts. It was also luck, Colonel. If the winds had been 10 knots stronger, or if I deviated 50 feet left in the valley, I'd be a smoking hole and you'd be studying my accident report instead of sitting in my class. I'm not interested in training pilots to take stupid risks. I'm interested in training pilots to make informed decisions when there are no good options." She clicked to the next slide. A weather map of that night, the storm system covering half of Afghanistan. "This is what I faced. Now someone tell me why I should have turned back." They spent the next hour dissecting her decisions, the risk calculus, the tactical considerations, the moral weight of 12 lives versus her own. It was brutal, clinical, and exactly what they needed. By the end, the skepticism had transformed into engagement. As the class filed out, the lieutenant colonel who'd spoken earlier approached. "Captain, I owe you an apology. I thought this was going to be some feel-good nonsense. Instead, that was the most honest conversation about risk I've ever had in a military setting." She nodded. "Risk is honest, Colonel. It's the one thing that doesn't care about your rank or your story. It just is." He left thoughtful. Cale gathered her notes, feeling the weight of responsibility. She wasn't just teaching tactics. She was shaping how the next generation of pilots would think about courage and fear. The months at Nellis blurred into a rhythm of instruction, flying, and growth. Cale found herself learning as much as she taught, how to articulate intuition, how to break down instinct into repeatable steps, how to admit when she didn't know something. Her students pushed her, questioned her, forced her to defend her decisions in ways that made her better. Lieutenant Reeves, her young admirer from Davis-Monthan, showed up mid-course as a student. He'd applied to weapons school on his first eligibility and somehow gotten selected despite having minimal experience. When he saw Cale was his instructor, his face lit up like Christmas morning. "Ma'am, this is incredible. I can't believe I get to learn from you." She kept her expression neutral. "Lieutenant, in this course there are no favorites. You'll be held to the same standard as everyone else. Possibly higher since you told me I was your inspiration. Don't make me regret that conversation." He snapped to attention. "Yes, ma'am." True to her word, she was merciless with him. Every mistake dissected, every tactical error highlighted, every moment of hesitation called out. The other instructors noticed and raised eyebrows, but she didn't care. Reeves had potential, but potential meant nothing without discipline. 3 weeks in, he nearly washed out after a disastrous close air support mission where he misidentified the target and almost killed friendly forces in the simulation. She called him into her office after the debrief. "Lieutenant, what happened up there?" He looked miserable. "I rushed the identification. I was so focused on being fast that I didn't confirm the target grid. And if those had been real JDAMs, if those had been real soldiers, they'd be dead, ma'am." Kale leaned back in her chair. "I'm going to tell you something I've never told a student before. On my 17th combat mission, I dropped a 500-pound bomb on what I thought was an enemy fighting position. Turned out it was a shepherd's hut. The family had evacuated, but I spent 3 days thinking I'd killed civilians because I rushed the identification." Reeves looked up, shocked. But you're human, Lieutenant. I make mistakes." "The difference between a mistake and a disaster is whether you learn from it. You have two choices right now: quit or get better. But if you stay, you don't get to be mediocre. You don't get to coast on potential. You have to be excellent because people's lives depend on it." He straightened. "I'll be excellent, ma'am." "Good. Now get out of my office and study your target identification. I want you to be able to identify a T-72 from a tractor at 20,000 feet while someone's shooting at you." He left with renewed purpose. The other instructors asked her later why she'd shared her mistake. "Because he needed to know that perfection isn't the standard," she said. "Excellence is." 6 weeks later, Reeves graduated in the middle of his class, not the top, but solid, competent, ready to lead. He thanked her afterward with tears in his eyes. "Ma'am, you made me better than I thought I could be," she smiled. "No, Lieutenant, I just showed you what was already there. Now go be the pilot someone else looks up to." He saluted and left. Cale watched him go, feeling something like pride, something like hope. This was the mission now, not saving lives in the moment, but preparing others to save lives later. The years passed. Cale made Major, then Lieutenant Colonel, climbing the ranks through competence and reputation. Her daughter grew from a child into a teenager, navigating her own challenges while her mother navigated briefings and budgets. They had their struggles. Deployments missed birthdays, training exercises interrupted school events, and the weight of expectations sometimes crushed them both. But they had each other, and that was enough. Iris, now 16, had developed her father's quiet intensity and her mother's stubborn will. She played soccer with a ferocity that terrified opposing teams and maintained a 4 GPA through sheer determination. She'd never known her father except through stories and photos, but she carried him anyway, a ghost made real through love and memory. One evening, Iris asked the question Cale had been dreading. "Mom, I want to apply to the Air Force Academy." Cale felt her heart stop. "What?" "I want to fly. Like you, like Dad served." "Sweetheart, you know what this life costs. You've lived it. Why would you choose this?" Iris met her eyes with the kind of certainty that couldn't be argued with. "Because you showed me that service matters, that some things are worth the cost. I want to be part of something bigger than myself." Cale wanted to argue, to list all the reasons this was a terrible idea, to protect her daughter from the weight of the uniform and the price of war. But she saw herself in Iris's expression, the same determination that had carried her through flight school, through combat, through the storm. "If this is what you want," Cale said slowly, "I'll support you. But you need to understand something. The military will take everything you're willing to give and then ask for more." Iris nodded. "I know. That's why I'm asking now, while I still have the choice." They hugged, and Cale felt the circle completing. The daughter of a Marine and an Air Force pilot, choosing to serve, carrying forward a tradition of sacrifice and honor. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. 2 years later, Cale stood in the audience at the Air Force Academy graduation as Iris received her commission as a second lieutenant. Her daughter wore the uniform with pride, standing tall among her classmates, ready to begin her own journey. Lieutenant Commander Webb was there, older now with gray in his hair, along with 3 of his original team. They'd made the trip from Virginia, all of them wanting to witness this moment. "Your kid's got your eyes," Webb said quietly. "Determined as hell," Cale smiled. "She's going to be a pilot, already got her slot for undergraduate pilot training. Like mother, like daughter." God help the Air Force. They laughed, the sound mixing with applause as the graduates threw their hats in the air. Kale watched her daughter celebrate with friends, feeling pride and fear braided together so tightly she couldn't tell them apart. That night at the hotel, Iris asked, "Mom, do you think I can be as good as you?" Kale took her daughter's hands. "You're going to be better, you have to be. Each generation should surpass the last. That's how we improve. I'm scared I'll let you down." "Then you're already ahead of where I was. I was too stubborn to admit fear. You're brave enough to name it. That makes you stronger." Years continued their march. Cale made full colonel and took command of an A-10 squadron at Moody Air Force Base in Georgia. Iris completed pilot training at the top of her class and earned her own A-10 assignment, different base, same aircraft, the legacy continuing. They texted constantly, sharing stories and advice, building a connection that transcended rank and generation. Cale flew less now, her job more administrative than tactical. She missed the cockpit but understood this was part of progression, stepping back so others could step forward. Her squadron was full of young pilots like Reeves, like her daughter, like she'd once been. Eager, determined, learning how to be excellent. One morning, her operations officer brought troubling news. "Ma'am, we have a situation. Major Chen's flight encountered weather over the training range. Lightning strike damaged his jet. He's trying to make it back, but visibility is near zero and his instruments are degraded." Cale felt ice in her stomach. "What's his fuel state?" 20 minutes, maybe less." She was in her staff car heading for the flight line before the ops officer finished talking. The tower controller gave her the situation. Major David Chen, experienced pilot, solid officer, now fighting a damaged A-10 through weather that was grounding everything else. The irony wasn't lost on her. "Widow 1 to tower, I'm taking the spare jet." The controller stammered. "Ma'am, you're not on the flight schedule and the weather." "I know what the weather is. I also know Major Chen. Get me cleared for takeoff." She was in the jet 8 minutes later, running the pre-flight checks from memory. The storm outside was nothing like Afghanistan. This was Georgia weather, violent but predictable. She could do this. She had to. The tower cleared her reluctantly. She took off into clouds so thick she couldn't see the runway behind her. The A-10 climbed through turbulence, ice forming on the wings, lightning turning the world white. She found Chen on radar, his IFF beacon flickering. "Viper 3, Widow 1, I'm 2 miles behind you. How you doing?" Chen's voice was tight with stress. "Widow 1, I'm flying on backup instruments and prayer. My navigation system is dead. I'm not sure which way is up and I'm running on fumes." "Copy. Follow my instructions exactly. I'm going to talk you home." For the next 15 minutes, Cale guided him through the storm the way someone once could have guided her, with calm precision and absolute confidence. She gave him headings, altitudes, talked him through each maneuver. When his engine coughed and nearly quit, she coached him through the emergency restart procedure. When he started to panic, she reminded him he'd flown and worse. It was a lie, but he believed it, and that was enough. They broke through the clouds 2 miles from Moody with fuel gauges reading zero. Chen landed first, his jet rolling to a stop just past the midfield barrier. Cale landed behind him, her own hands shaking now that it was over. On the ground, Chen met her with a salute that became a hug. "Ma'am, you saved my life." She stepped back, maintaining professional distance. "You saved your own life, Major. You kept flying when things went wrong. That's the job," the base commander called her that evening. "Colonel, you violated about 6 different regulations flying into that storm without proper clearance." "Yes, sir. I should probably ground you." "Yes, sir." There was a long pause. "But I'm not going to because Major Chen is alive and his wife isn't planning a funeral. Just try to stop being heroic. It's bad for my blood pressure," she smiled. "I'll try, sir." The story spread as stories do. The colonel who'd flown through a storm to save a SEAL team had done it again, this time for one of her own. The younger pilots looked at her with awe. The older ones shook their heads in recognition. Once a hog driver, always a hog driver. That weekend, she drove to Atlanta to meet Iris for dinner. Her daughter was stationed at Savannah, close enough for occasional visits. They sat in a small Italian restaurant, sharing pasta and stories. "I heard about Major Chen," Iris said. "Mom, you could have been killed." "So could he?" "That's not the point." Cale set down her fork. "Then what is the point, sweetheart?" Iris struggled for words. I've spent my whole life watching you risk everything for other people, and I'm proud of you. But I'm also terrified that one day you won't come home. That's the deal we made when we put on the uniform. You know that, you made the same choice. I know, but knowing and accepting are different things. They sat in silence for a moment. Finally, Cale spoke. Your father once told me that fear means you understand the stakes. He said the day you stop being afraid is the day you've forgotten what you're fighting for. I'm scared every time I fly. But I also know that if I don't go, someone else won't come home. Can you live with that equation? Iris nodded slowly. I'm trying to. That's all any of us can do. 5 years later, Colonel Cale Morvan retired from the Air Force after 22 years of service. The ceremony was held at Davis-Monthan, where it had all begun, with hundreds of people in attendance. Her squadron formed up, A-10s arranged in perfect lines. General Okonkwo, now 3 stars and running Air Combat Command, gave the speech. Cale Morvan represents the finest traditions of air power, courage, competence, and commitment to the mission above self. She's flown in combat, taught our best pilots, commanded with wisdom, and inspired a generation. When people ask me what makes a great officer, I tell them about the night she flew through a storm to save 12 lives. Not because it was impossible, but because it was necessary. Webb was there with his entire original team, all of them retired now but still brothers. They'd brought their families, their children, wanting them to meet the pilot who'd given them futures. Iris was there in her flight suit, now a captain herself with her own combat deployment completed. She stood at attention with tears streaming down her face. After the ceremony, Cale did her final walk around an A-10. She touched the nose, the wings, the tail, the ugly, beautiful machine that had been her office, her weapon, her home. A maintainer approached, a young woman with grease on her hands and determination in her eyes. Ma'am, I just wanted to say thank you. I'm enlisted now, but I'm applying to officer training school because of you. You showed me that women can do anything in this Air Force. Cale smiled. You don't need me to show you that. You already know it, but I'm glad I could be part of your journey. The maintainer saluted and walked away. Cale stood alone with the jet, feeling the weight of decades, the accumulated miles, the sum of choices that had brought her here. She thought about the storm, about the SEALs, about all the missions in between. She thought about her husband who'd never seen their daughter grow up. She thought about Iris carrying forward the legacy. 22 years, thousands of flight hours, countless lives touched, saved, inspired. It was enough. It had to be enough. She walked away from the flight line for the last time and didn't look back. Civilian life was strange. Cale took a job as a test pilot for a defense contractor, flying new aircraft and writing reports. The work was interesting but lacked the urgency of combat. She missed the military's clarity of purpose, the sense that what she did mattered in immediate, measurable ways. But she also appreciated sleeping in her own bed every night, not getting shot at, and being present for the life she'd spent 22 years defending from a distance. Iris visited when she could, bringing stories from her squadron and questions about tactics. She was a good pilot, careful, competent, respected by her peers. She'd inherited her mother's skill but avoided her mother's reputation for recklessness. Cale was grateful for that. One daughter's worth of heart-stopping heroics was enough for any family. On the 10th anniversary of the Storm mission, the Air Force published a case study. Widow 1. Decision-making under extreme uncertainty became required reading at every Air Force pilot training base. Cale's decisions were dissected, analyzed, held up as both exemplary and cautionary. She received emails from students asking questions, from historians wanting interviews, from pilots saying she'd inspired their careers. She answered every email personally, always with the same message. I was just doing my job. The real heroes are the ones who do it every day without recognition. But privately, she understood what the mission had become, not just a rescue, but a symbol. Proof that one person with the right skills and the right determination could change outcomes. Evidence that women belonged in combat, that experience mattered, that courage came in many forms. The story had outlived the event, becoming mythology, teaching lessons beyond the tactical. And if that mythology inspired young pilots to be better, to try harder, to believe they could do impossible things, then maybe the myth was more important than the truth. On a cool October evening, Cale attended a reunion of Webb's SEAL team. They met at a barbecue restaurant in Virginia Beach, 12 men now scattered across the country but still brothers, still connected by what they'd survived together. She walked in wearing jeans and a leather jacket, feeling underdressed among all the tactical beards and combat experience. Webb saw her first and let out a whoop. There she is, the only Air Force pilot we respect. They surrounded her, offering drinks and stories and the kind of rough affection that came from shared trauma. Their families were there too, wives, children, partners who'd heard the story 100 times but wanted to meet the pilot who'd made those stories possible. One of the kids, a girl about 10, approached shyly. "Are you really Widow One?" Cale knelt down to her level. "I am. What's your name?" "Emma. My dad says you saved his life." "Your dad saved his own life by being brave. I just drove the taxi." The girl considered this seriously. "I want to be a pilot like you when I grow up," Cale smiled. "Then study hard, stay determined, and don't let anyone tell you what you can't do. The sky belongs to everyone." Emma ran back to her father, and Cale felt the cycle turning again. How many children had been born because of that night? How many futures existed because she'd ignored the weather and flown anyway? It was overwhelming when she let herself think about it. Webb appeared with 2 beers. "They can't believe you came. You asked, how could I say no?" "Fair point, but seriously, Cale, and I'm using your first name because we're not in uniform and rank doesn't matter here. You should know what that night meant to us. Not just that we survived, but how we survived. You could have waited for better weather, everyone would have understood, but you came anyway. That kind of commitment. It changes how we think about service." She took a long drink of beer. "Marcus, I did what I was trained to do. What any good pilot would do." "Bullshit. Any good pilot would have turned back. You're not any good pilot. You're one of the best I've ever seen in any service." "You're biased because I saved your ass." "Damn right I am." They laughed, and for a moment the 10 years collapsed into nothing. They were back in the storm, back in the valley, back in that moment when everything hung in the balance and one person's decision tipped the scales toward life. The party continued late into the night. Stories were told, jokes were shared, memories were honored. When Cale finally left, driving back to her hotel through empty streets, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace. The years accumulated quietly after that. Cale flew test missions, consulted on aircraft design, occasionally gave talks at military schools. She watched her daughter progress through the ranks, earning her own reputation as a skilled pilot and leader. Iris made major at her first look, squadron commander shortly after, following a trajectory that looked remarkably like her mother's but was entirely her own. They spoke every week, comparing notes on leadership and life. The calls were precious, sacred even, 2 women who understood the weight of command and the price of excellence. When Iris deployed to the Middle East for her 3rd combat tour, Cale spent 6 months sleeping poorly and checking the casualty reports compulsively. It never got easier, watching someone you love fly into danger. If anything, it got harder, because now she knew exactly what could go wrong and how quickly it happened. Iris came home safe, added more combat hours to her logbook, and immediately volunteered for a staff job at the Pentagon. Cale called her the night she heard. "The Pentagon? Really? Mom, someone has to make the decisions about what aircraft we buy and how we train pilots. Might as well be someone who's actually flown in combat. You sound like me at your age. It's disturbing." "Good. I learned from the best." They laughed, and Cale felt pride mixed with the ever-present fear. Her daughter was becoming someone who shaped the Air Force rather than just serving in it. The responsibility was enormous, but if anyone could handle it, Iris could. On the 20th anniversary of the Storm mission, the Air Force invited Cale to speak at the weapons school graduation. She almost declined. 2 decades felt like ancient history, and she'd told the story so many times it felt rehearsed and hollow. But Lieutenant Colonel Reeves, now an instructor himself, called personally. "Ma'am, these students need to hear from you, not the legend you, the person who made the decision and carried the weight." So she went to Nellie's, walking the same halls she'd once taught in, and stood before a class of pilots who weren't born when she flew through that storm. She told them the truth. I was terrified. I broke rules. I got lucky. If you're looking for a blueprint for heroism, this isn't it. What I can tell you is this: when the choice is between safe and right, you'll know what to do. And whatever you choose, you'll carry it forever. Make sure it's something you can live with. The silence after was profound. Then one student raised his hand. Ma'am, do you regret it? Never, not for 1 second. Those men deserve someone willing to try. If I'd turned back, I'd have regretted that every day for the rest of my life. Fear of dying is powerful, but fear of failing the mission is stronger. After the talk, the students lined up to shake her hand. Each one left with something: perspective, inspiration, understanding that excellence meant carrying doubt and moving forward anyway. Reeves walked her out afterward. Thank you for coming, ma'am. You have no idea how much it meant. I think I do. Someone once showed me that competence matters more than confidence. I'm just passing it forward. They parted as old friends do, promising to stay in touch, knowing they probably wouldn't, but grateful anyway. Kale flew home to Arizona feeling like she'd closed a circle, like some chapter had finally ended. But chapters never really end. They just become foundation for what comes next. Kale Morvan lived to see her grandson born, Iris's son, named Marcus after the SEAL commander who'd called for help that night. She held the baby in her arms and saw generations cascading forward, lives built on the choice she'd made in a storm 2 decades earlier. Webb came to the hospital, now retired and gray but still carrying himself like someone who'd fought wars and won. He looked at the baby and smiled. Your daughter named him after me. She did. Said you were part of the story and the story matters. The story is you, Kale. It was always you. She shook her head. The story is bigger than any of us. It's about service, sacrifice, the choice to be excellent when mediocrity would be easier. You embodied that, so did your men, so does Iris. This baby will carry it forward or he won't. Either way, we did our part. Webb touched the baby's hand with the gentleness of someone who'd seen too much death and treasured every new life. We did. And it was enough. Years later, when Kale Morvan died at 86 after a long life well lived, her funeral was attended by hundreds. SEAL teams came from across the country. A-10 pilots, 3 generations deep, filled the church. Her daughter spoke, her grandson too, both of them wearing uniforms, both carrying forward the tradition of service and excellence. 4 A-10s performed the missing man formation, one breaking away to symbolize the fallen. The sound of those turbofan engines was a hymn, a prayer, a promise that the mission continued. Her call sign, Widow One, was retired. No one would ever fly under that name again. It belonged to history now, to legend, to the pilot who'd flown through a storm because 12 men needed her and she'd refused to let them down. In the cemetery, as they lowered her flag-draped coffin, Webb stood with his team, old men now but still brothers. They saluted together, holding it until the last note of taps faded across the Arizona desert. One of them whispered, "She was the best of us." And maybe she was. Or maybe she was just someone who understood that excellence means showing up when it's hardest, doing the job when it's scariest, and carrying the weight because someone has to. The storm had ended long ago. But the legacy flew on, passed from pilot to pilot, generation to generation, a story about courage and duty, and one night when the sky tried to kill everyone and one person said no. They tell the story still, in ready rooms and flight schools and bars where pilots gather. The details have smoothed over time, facts becoming legend, legend becoming myth. But the core remains true. Even the SEALs dropped their gear when the poor single mom's A-10 broke through the storm. Not because she was superhuman, but because she was exactly human enough, scared, determined, competent, and unwilling to let her fear matter more than the mission. That's the story. That's the legacy. That's what it means to be Widow One. And somewhere in squadrons scattered across the world, young pilots hear that story and think, if she could do it, maybe I can too. The sky still calls. The mission still matters. And excellence is still the standard. Because Kale Morvan flew through a storm once and changed what everyone thought was possible. That's not just a story. That's a promise, written in contrails across a darkening sky, that someone will always answer when the call comes. Always. The end.